They say the ocean forgets what we do to it, but I have never believed that. On the morning the fortress at Truk began to burn, the sea wore a black memory, heavy smoke flattened against a tropical sky, oil slicking the swells into mirrors that reflected our future back at us. I remember tasting cordite on clean salt air and thinking, if there's any justice left in war, it isn't in who fires first, but in who understands what they're doing when they pull the lanyard. I was a gunnery officer on Iowa, and that morning I felt like a historian with a stopwatch, measuring the last minutes of an old world. We were running at 32 knots, a long steel city shuddering on turbine breath, the hull humming a note you feel in your ribs more than you hear in your ears. Inside the plotting room, where the ship thinks, the fans ticked, and the deck trembled, and men spoke in a grammar of numbers. I had my hands on the face of a machine that never lied. The rangekeeper, our mechanical conscience, receiving range and bearing from the Mark 8 set up top, turning them into futures. The radar scope drew 4 pale insects crawling away from the lagoon's mouth. They had names I would not learn to pronounce cleanly until years later: Kuturi, Mikaz, Noaki, and a smaller shadow astern, but on the scope they were simply impulses, coordinates that kept insisting on becoming solutions. Captain McCrea stood at the plotting table like a man who knew the difference between daring and drama. When the word came down from Admiral Spruant's surface action, McCrea didn't smile. He didn't need to. The older chiefs on the bridge did it for him with the quiet tightening of jaw and eye that said, "One more time for the big guns." Around us, the war had already rewritten its rules. Carriers had flattened the fortress from above. Our own fighters had carved the air into ribbons of burning silk. We all knew where the future lived now, on decks with arresting wires and ordnance hoists and men who fought in oxygen masks. But on that afternoon, in that heat, the Admiral had reached back toward us toward steel and recoil and line of sight honor and said, "Run them down." Beyond the horizon, the lagoon boiled. You could smell it, even here. Emulsified oil and wet ash, a reek like a scrapyard struck by lightning. The sea was a skin-stretched drum-tight, and Iowa beat it with her bow, throwing sleet off both shoulders. Messages came from Cowpen's scouts. The voice on the TBS clipped by wind. Contacts north-northwest, speed high, course steady. We did not need eyes to believe them. Our radar believed first, and in my line of work belief had weight, measured in yards and seconds. The Mark 8 painted the escapes clearly, returned steady at 32,000 yards. We were blind men with instruments, and we could see farther than sight. In the plotting room, we took the returns and fed the ships. You learn to think like a shell in that room. What air will you breathe? What wind will shove you? How will the Earth's turn smuggle drift into your path? Powder temp logged, propellant condition checked. We teased changes out of decimals because, at 15 miles, a mislaid tenth is an epitaph. The Mark 1A's cams murmured, steel confessing its math. Cogs gave our doubts a place to rest. Set deflection 5 to 2 left, elevation 1 to 7 decimal, I said. Not to be theatrical, but because every number spoken aloud becomes a promise. When you're about to put a ton of steel into flight, promises are the only honest currency. Somewhere to starboard, a boatswain's pipe sang and died. Somewhere above, the directors caged their optics and let radar be king. I walked the path I always walked before a first salvo breach to hoist a rammer, touching nothing, checking everything, putting my hand to cold metal the way a clergyman might touch railings on the way to the pulpit. Turret 2's crew were bare forearms and white knuckles, and the easy swearing of men who trust one another with their hearing and lives. 6 silk bags a gun. We handled them the way you handle a sleeping child, tender and alert to the awful things that can happen to something so soft in a world built of edges. The bridge voice broke over the circuit. Target Group 4 contacts, bearing 348, range 3 to 1.4. Intent to engage when solution stabilizes. We did not say yes, we answered with numbers. I watched the trace settle, erratic, smoothing like a bird steadying in a gust. Somewhere ahead, those ships, all that steel, and all those boys believed distance would right them a favor. I remember thinking of Tsushima and of the instructors who taught me that courage could close water faster than arithmetic. I admired those Japanese officers I had never met, admired what they believed about nerve and night and the wicked beauty of a well-laid torpedo, and I knew that none of that could save them from a problem that had already been solved without them. Solution green, the computer told us, without words, through the feel of the dials and the confidence of the plot. Stand by, turret 2, I said. And in that instant the ship shrank to this room, to this breath, to this sequence. Elevation set, deflection set, check wear tables, correct muzzle velocity for today's humidity and powder warmth, final. The intercom popped. Bridge to main battery. On my mark. A pause long enough to count your sins. Then the mark came, and the ship spoke. A 16-inch gun does not simply fire. It commits a physics sermon. The first salvo jumped us 3 barrels, vomiting daylight into a sky already ruined by smoke, the blast tearing its own weather across the deck. You do not hear the guns so much as you experience them through chest walls and molars. The blast deflectors took the breath and glowed for an astonished moment. I ordered my world forward. Spotters hot, fall of shot on. Up top, with the directors, men leaned into glass that could not see the target but could see the sea near it, and radar stitched the invisible into a ledger we could read. 45 seconds is longer than it sounds when you've just thrown almost 3 tons of anger into the air. In those seconds, we lived inside a fuse. Reports came back like calm rain. 1 short, 1 over, 1 right at. Astraddle our first confession that we were not guessing. Up 1-0-0, I said. The corrections went in. Iowa's bones thrummed as the ship walked into her own recoil and found her gait again. Above, the sky seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if men could truly write with parabolas over a horizon they could not see. We felt the chase in the deck plates. New Jersey's thunder chased ours across the water, and for a heartbeat I saw us the way history would. 2 greyhounds loosed from a leash that no longer mattered, racing not against ships, but against time itself. Spruance, somewhere ahead in Indianapolis, had put his finger on the scale of meaning. The carriers could have finished this from a comfort we were beginning to call normal. Instead, he'd chosen deliberately to ask if battleships still had a place in a world that no longer needed them to decide oceans. He was not fighting the Japanese alone. He was arguing with the century. In my phones, a voice from topside. Enemy cruiser maneuvering. Wakes indicate torp launch. Even without eyes, even without a horizon, you can feel the old dangers return, the idea that somewhere out there, a single fish with your name could make your arguments moot. On the bridge, they bumped our course 2 points without panic, and the helm made obedience look like grace. We were still closing. The radar picture wrote it without poetry. Range bleeding down, bearing steady, enemy speed eroding. The sea has a way of making a brave run look like a slow confession. I have been asked, years later, if I felt anything for the men on those ships before we could see their masts. The honest answer is yes, and the more honest answer is that feeling had no place to sit until after the work was done. In the room where numbers turn into outcomes, sentiment is a loose screw. But somewhere under the math, the human part of me kept wanting to ask forgiveness of men I could not yet see. We were not better than they were. We were only earlier to a different understanding. Second salvo fire. The ship punched the air again. This time the wait felt shorter because certainty shrinks time. We had the pattern, and the pattern had us. The ocean out there, just beyond the line that our eyes could not cross, was about to translate equations into flame. Above, a spotter's voice came back, clipped, and even, as if he were reading the barometer. Bursts in superstructure. Fires observed. On the bridge, they did not cheer. Below, no one clapped backs. We did what men do when an answer arrives exactly as calculated. We moved to the next line. Not yet, I told myself. The ledger still held 3 more names. Out on the radar, we watched the survivors scramble their geometry, cutting angles like knife fighters in a dark room. Courage has a silhouette, and theirs was clean. But we had lived too long inside the machinery of prediction to mistake bravery for rescue. Iowa leaned into her speed, the wake chalking a long white sentence behind us, and the sky kept its oil-black breath. The day's logic was now inescapable. We had been asked a question in the language of range and time. We were answering in the only tense that matters in gunnery, the future continuous. We had begun. And somewhere ahead, the horizon that hid them could no longer hide the past ending. History books like to explain war in diagrams and steel tonnage charts. They speak of calibers and doctrines, as though men did not breathe inside those numbers. But when I think back to what we believed that day off Truk, I remember, not the numbers first, but the ghost of another fleet, half a century older, dying in a different ocean under a different flag. Tsushima. The Japanese learned there that belief could curve trajectories, and courage could carry a ship closer than fear allowed. They wrote their creed in that victory, a creed that outlived usefulness long enough to kill the sons of those who made it. I learned Tsushima too. I sat in Annapolis classrooms breathing chalk dust and reverence, listening as instructors traced Admiral Togo's turn across slate, the perfect crossing of the T. We studied his guns, his daring, his training. And in those lectures, there was a quiet envy, the recognition that long ago, in someone else's war, perfect seamanship and iron will could still force history to kneel. But the ocean does not repeat lessons, it replaces them. Standing at the plotting board, I could feel Tsushima's ghost scratching faint warnings in the back of my mind. The Japanese steaming ahead of us carried that ghost too. They had inherited a faith that souls mattered more than circuits, that optics guided by honor could outthink machinery driven by arithmetic. They believed men were the fulcrum of war. We were discovering, painfully, that in this era, men were just the fingers that set machines in motion. A petty officer beside me cleared his throat over the hum of ventilators. "Sir," he murmured, "first ship at Tsushima closed to 8,000 yards before firing." 8,000 yards. We were preparing to kill at 4 times that distance without ever seeing a hull with our bare eyes. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. In his voice, I heard the realization, the same one blooming in me, that we were writing a new scripture on top of an old grave. Above us, the Mark 8 radar pulsed its invisible insistence into the haze, sweeping the sea like a blind prophet that had decided to stop asking permission to see. I remember running a hand across the side of the analog computer, my fingertips skating the grooves of gears cut by men who would never taste cordite or hear metal scream under impact. They machined reality in thousandths of inches so we could write endings in miles. People imagine radar as a glowing screen and a blip. But what fought that day was not a screen, it was a conversation. Radar told us where. Barometers told us density. Thermometers told us powder temperature. The ship's log whispered wind. Even the Earth's rotation had an opinion, nudging everything a hair to the right, enough to matter when steel flies 20 miles and gravity sings its long, slow note beneath it. Our rangekeeper god, that machine was a temple. Brass wheels and cams and screws, driven by men with calluses and pencil stubs behind ears. It solved futures before we could finish thinking the present. In that steel heart, there was no ego, no doctrine, no myth, only truth expressed in turning metal. Japan had philosophy. We had precision. And yet, inside me, a whisper. Once, they had been right. Once, battle was blood and breath and vision and instinct. Once, the human animal mattered more than the wires humming in our bulkheads. Part of me loved that world even as I helped bury it. The sea was becoming a mathematician's kingdom. Romance drowned first. A klaxon barked. Fresh bearings came in, the Japanese ships adjusting course like frightened quail sensing talons above. They ran north, threading passes they knew by heritage and hope. On their bridges, I imagined officers with binoculars to salt-stung eyes, searching for an enemy horizon that did not exist yet in light, only in equations. One of my talkers, a kid from Nebraska, with a voice made for calm nights and piano rooms, murmured across the circuit, "Feels wrong, sir. Hitting someone before you see him." I didn't answer at first. I watched the solution tighten on the plot, the pencil lines converging like fate narrowing toward inevitability. Then I said quietly, "War grows out of fairness the way coral grows from steel hulls, slow, and only after death starts it." He didn't reply. Young men do not always need explanations, they need something to hold, even if it's only tone. We were not cruel. But neither were we willing to die politely. I thought then of the Japanese Admiralty, men in white gloves and lacquered wood rooms, who believed the world would behave the way it had when they were midshipmen. They had read Mahan and lived Togo. They trained marksmen to read the sea like scripture. They believed wind and sweat could outduel circuits and relays. Their mistake was not arrogance. It was loyalty to a world that had already ended before the first American carrier ever left Pearl Harbor. On Iowa, our loyalty was to outcomes, not ideologies. We fired again. The second salvo rolled through the hull, a physical gospel. I closed my eyes for 6 heartbeats, not to pray, but to hear the machine speak. When the spotters' voices came, they were steady. Hits forward, secondary explosions. Men died at that sentence. Men clutching valves, men in sandals, men trained since boyhood to think dying bravely for the Emperor would crown their names with honor. I wondered if any looked up toward the clouds, searching for the shape of the ship, killing them, a ship they could not see, only feel. I wondered if any whispered apologies to their fathers for losing a war they never had a fair chance to win. Spruance's gamble was proving itself. On the bridge, no jubilation, only the rhythm of duty. One victory does not earn celebration, only further orders. We were the tip of a spear that reached from Iowa cornfields to Brooklyn yards to the quiet minds of engineers in rooms without windows. When war finally ends, medals tarnish and parades fade. What remains is the machinery rusting on rails, sleeping in museums, and the memory of how small a man feels when he realizes he did not simply fight in history. He lived at the hinge of it. In that plotting room, with sweat beading my temples and my pencil hovering over trajectory changes, I felt the hinge creak. The Japanese were not failing because they lacked courage. They were failing because courage had stopped being currency and become ornament. We had replaced faith with radar, replaced instinct with computation. And in that exchange, the battleship itself, the thing I served with pride, was already turning from king to relic, even as she roared like a god. The first ship had begun to die. 3 more fled ahead. And we followed, not with passion, but with inevitability humming through relays and gears. This was not cruelty. This was not triumph. This was evolution, and evolution never negotiates. "Next range," I ordered. "Update plot, continue pursuit." The men obeyed, pencils scratching. The machine whispered futures. And outside, the Pacific swallowed another illusion whole. There comes a moment in every pursuit where distance stops being geography and becomes psychology. Past the 30,000-yard mark, you are not chasing ships, you are chasing ghosts, and the only proof they exist is the echo they leave in your instruments. By early afternoon, the Japanese flotilla ahead of us had become exactly that. Traces, bearings, drift lines sketched over blue we could not yet see. But their desperation had a shape, and we could feel it in the deck beneath our boots. Iowa surged, engines hot enough to brand memory into steel. The boilers below rooms hotter than any hell men had imagined long before this war rumbled with the stubborn song of American industry. I had stood in those spaces once on inspection. Valves like muscle, gauges trembling, sailors stripped to the waist in heat that turned sweat to steam. Down there, the war did not feel noble or strategic. It felt like shovel work in the furnace of a world that refused to cool. Range 29,800 yards. Bearing steady. A voice called. "Plot stable, rate decreasing," answered another. The numbers were becoming sentences, sentences becoming prophecy. They were running out of ocean to bleed. On the bridge, Captain McCrea stood with the poise of a man who understood exactly what speed costs a hull and yet demanded every knot. His face did not betray victory, nor hunger, only duty. He leaned into the windows with hands behind his back, as if he could will the horizon to surrender its secrets. "Maintain flank," he ordered quietly. "Report any variance in bearing." Our destroyers fanned out ahead like shepherd dogs, radar sweeps overlapping, eager and lean. Behind us, New Jersey's silhouette cut the haze, following our wake like a steel conviction. Heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans clung to the pursuit, slower, older, but proud to ride the same hunt. Carrier Cowpens lingered behind like a guardian angel with folded wings, her aircraft already streaked with smoke and triumph from the morning's slaughter. Above us, lone scouts circled, their engines faint, like insects buzzing in a cathedral. I felt none of the triumph propaganda insists soldiers must feel. There was no swelling music here, only the steady hum of electric motors driving range drums, the clack of typewriters logging time and distance, and the soft curses of men furrowing brows over trigonometry that could kill. I leaned over the rangekeeper, fingers trailing its casing like a pianist brushing ivory before performance. A second lieutenant near me tightened a dial, then stopped and looked up. "Sir, how do you train for this?" he whispered. "To fire at ships you can't see?" I answered not as an officer, but as a man who had learned humility through steel. "You don't. You train to trust the math, and then you pray you deserve the machine you've been given." His jaw set. In that moment, I saw the age-old tension, a human heart still wanting to believe his courage mattered more than his equations. We are always slow to surrender romance, even as the world moves on without it. "Contacts altering course starboard bearing 350, the talker called. "Enemy attempting evasive pattern," someone else replied. It was a futile dance. Radar does not blink. Radar does not flinch. Radar does not lose a ship in smoke or swell or night. It hunts the way truth hunts, quietly, steadily, until denial has no shoreline left. "Transmit to division," McCrea said. "No change. Stay on intercept line." We could have waited. Let submarines pick them off. Let aircraft return for one more bite. But Spruance had chosen spectacle and revelation. He wanted proof that the battleship was not merely legacy steel shadowing a new age of wings. He wanted to remind friend and foe that technology could sharpen tradition into something frighteningly precise. As we advanced, I imagined the Japanese decks, men rushing torpedoes forward, wiping optics, shouting bearings they could barely trust through salt spray. Their doctrine told them to close distance. Their training told them to find silhouette and soul in the target. But there was nothing to see. No mighty American column rising from the horizon. No mast to fix range. Only empty water and the cold hum of a radar pulse stroking them from beyond sight. I wondered if any among them had ever imagined such a thing. To die at the edge of vision. Not by duel, but by algorithm. They deserved better than a doctrine that froze in time while the world turned under it. Range 25,600 yards. Enemy speed decreasing. Wind shift to northeast, adjust 2/10. Propellant temperature holding 92 degrees. Apply correction. We spoke like surgeons, and maybe that is what fire control was: surgery at the scale of nations. Precision that spared no one. Not even the romantic notion of what war once had been. The first lieutenant approached me then, voice low. "There was a time, you know, when ships fought for honor." I didn't meet his eyes. There was also a time when ships sank with all hands because someone misjudged a cloud over the horizon. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Progress has no interest in nostalgia. Ahead, the sea darkened storm wall, or smoke, hard to tell. The Japanese were disappearing into weather now, trusting the elements to fight for them. But weather is honest. It does not take sides. Our scopes tracked through mist, through rain, through the last veil war could place between hunter and hunted. A voice broke the quiet. Bridge requests fire control standby. Engagement window approaching. My throat tightened. The moment was coming again, the moment where prediction becomes consequence. I ran my hand once more along the edge of the computer, cold, precise, unmoved by fear or memory. There are moments in a war when you realize you are not merely fighting an enemy, you are witnessing the death of an era, and sometimes, cruelly, you are the one helping to kill it. We bore north like a judgment. Somewhere ahead, metal fled. Somewhere behind, history followed. Solutions updating, I whispered. Prepare main battery. The ocean held its breath again. And we rode across it, instruments singing, hearts steadying, waiting for the second act of the last great battleship war. There is a silence that comes right before enormous violence, a kind of reverence, as though the ship itself is praying. We felt it then. Not fear, not hesitation, but the breath a machine takes before it exhales history. The Japanese were slipping into mist, but radar traced them like wet ink on paper, each sweep stitching certainty into the unknown. Range 22,400 yards, a voice murmured. Plot steady. Enemy turning to port. Solution stable. Those words felt heavier than any battle cry. They meant inevitability had found its mark. Macrea's voice came over the circuit, steady as a metronome. Prepare to fire. The fire control room exhaled as one. Men straightened. Pencil tips hovered. A Marine near the hatch touched the small cross under his shirt. And I, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, thought of my mother's kitchen at dusk, the window open, radio murmuring swing tunes, flour in the air like battlefield smoke, softened by domestic light. It is strange what the mind reaches for when it knows it is about to take life. Above, in the turrets, breaches locked shut with a metallic authority. Ramrods withdrew. Silk bags sat in chambers like sleep before thunder. Each one smelled faintly sweet single-base powder always did, and when guns fire, that sweetness turns bitter in your throat, like truth you don't want to swallow. Main battery standby. The Japanese cruiser out there, Koturi, was already bleeding from the morning's air assault. Her captain must have known, even before we fired the first salvo, that his ship was running away from inevitability, not toward safety. I imagined him on his bridge, cloth around his neck against salt wind, binoculars raised to nothing but gray, knowing death wore no face today, only coordinates. Somewhere among his crew, boys young as ours loaded torpedoes with hands that shook not from cowardice, but from the terrible understanding that bravery does not alter trajectory. And then Iowa spoke. The guns did not just fire, they pronounced. The moment the triggers were pulled, the ship became a body of violence, steel bones flexing, turret mounts groaning, deck plates answering recoil with the low animal growl of physics. The blast punched the air so hard it pushed back against our skin. Dust leapt from rivets. My teeth rang. The entire ocean felt suddenly smaller. 45 seconds. Eternity, pretending to be arithmetic. Spotter report. A heartbeat, then another. Splash 2 short, 1 over. Straddle. A quiet, satisfied breath rippled through the room. We were on her. We would adjust inches over miles. We were writing in the sky with steel pens. Up 100, fire when ready. The second salvo roared forth like the judgment of centuries. Even in the plotting room, we felt heat, like the ship's soul had flared. Someone whispered, "God help them," and no one laughed. Because faith sounds reasonable when you can kill across horizons. The wait this time felt shorter, or perhaps acceptance shrinks time. Impact, forward superstructure, fire observed, which meant men now burned where they had stood moments ago in duty. War isn't cinematic fireballs, it's screaming steel, scalding steam, and a sudden absence where voices used to be. We did not cheer. We corrected. Left 2-0, maintain elevation. Koturi answered. But her answer was only symbol. Flak bursts in the mist, tracers trying to prick a horizon where she believed we must surely lurk. She was firing at ghosts, and ghosts suffer no wounds. Then came the torpedoes. Lookouts called faint white wakes slicing water, long knives running silent toward our hull. The Japanese cruiser had thrown her last prayer into the sea. New Jersey turned just enough to let them hiss past her bow, not a triumph, not luck, just geometry refusing to yield. Enemy destroyer launching. Another voice barked. Mika's, loyal to the point of suicide, charged into danger like a samurai running at artillery. I felt something crack inside me then, courage that pure deserved a duel, not mathematics. But war does not pause for dignity. Secondary batteries tracking. Cruisers opening fire. Maintain main battery priority on cruiser. Finisher. The sea lit in flashes as 8-inch shells from our cruisers joined our thunder. I imagined Japanese sailors shouting orders, feeling their decks shudder, the smell of burning paint and ruptured fuel lines invading their lungs. There is a moment on a dying ship when time stretches cruelly long enough for hope to die in increments. 2 more salvos. Then, contact rolling. She's going down. We had not seen her clearly yet, not with human eyes. Only radar eyes. Only mathematical sight. And yet she was dying because men in our steel cave believed numbers over beliefs. The destroyer followed soon after, refusing surrender even as her hull spit fire. Reports of torpedoes, again courage stubborn unto death. Then an explosion that shook airwaves and hearts. We knew a magazine had gone. A life of steel ended in a breath of flame. Enemy destroyer breaking up. No survivors in sight. We did not celebrate. We logged times. We updated plots. We checked bearings for the next target. Above us, smoke smeared the sky like remorse. Around us, the ocean swallowed steel and memory without preference. Someone whispered near me, "They fought hard." I nodded. They did everything right except believe in the future. There was no cruelty in that sentence. Only grief. We resumed the chase, engines driving us forward into weather and distance, shells being hoisted for the next exchange, radar sweeping like a heartbeat. The horizon ahead held one more ship, and the part of me still dreaming of Tsushima prayed she might turn and fight so we could see her before ending her. But radar had no patience for sentiment, and the sea, that ancient witness, gave us no permission to mourn. Not yet. "Continue pursuit," Macria ordered. "Main battery ready? This isn't over." No, I thought. It's only just beginning for them, for us, and for the world that will never again wage war the way our fathers imagined it. We chased on, our wake long and white behind us, a chalk line across the Pacific marking where tradition drowned and technology rose to take its place. By the time the last destroyer fled into the mist, the ocean felt like a ledger names struck through in fire, one still clinging to ink, Noaki. She ran like a creature that understood, far too late, the world had changed without asking her permission. Spray peeled off her bow, her boilers screaming as if iron could feel fear. On our screens she was only a wavering pulse, a heartbeat fighting to outrun mathematics. The sky had gone bruised, clouds smearing the horizon like someone had thumbed soot across the day. Rain sheets staggered in curtains, swallowing distance, giving the illusion of escape. But illusions do not confuse radar. Not anymore. Range 34,000, bearing 355, still pulling away. Our talker's voice was steady, too steady. You learn a tone in war, the one where men begin to realize they are watching not a fight, but a moment of transformation. The young ones don't always understand that feeling. The older ones look like they're listening to the world turn. Noaki was fast designed to fight in a world that believed speed and nerve could steal victory from heavier guns. In another era, she might have lived long enough to write her own tales. Here, she was simply late to the truth. I thought of the men aboard her engine crews shoveling until their arms numb, torpedo teams staring at empty racks, captain gripping railing hard enough to blanch knuckles. They must have known the truth by then, Courage is not a currency you can spend when the bank of fate has switched to digital ledgers. Main battery ready. Request firing solution. We were beyond the edge now, where no battleship in history had fired with intent to kill, where theory met sky. I felt the plotting room shift into something ritualistic. Pencils lifted, knobs turned, numbers whispered like scripture. The ship's gyros hummed, relays clicked, and the Mark 1A caught the scent of another problem to solve. Solution stable. Fire when ready. The words hung in the air like a last prayer. Fire. Iowa thundered, the sound rolling across the sea like the voice of an old god remembering its own name. New Jersey answered, her own guns adding a deeper note, two Titans speaking across the storm wall. Each shell climbed into cloud and vanished, not as violence, but as possibility. When the shock faded, silence returned heavy, awestruck, waiting. We listened for the report like philosophers waiting for truth to clear its throat. Straddle, shells left and right close aboard. So close, so impossibly close at nearly 20 miles. If you ask me what I felt then, it wasn't triumph. It was reverence. We were pushing against the edge of what steel and powder and human ambition were ever meant to do. The sea had boundaries once. We were rewriting them in smoke. Enemy continuing to withdraw, range increasing. A younger officer muttered, barely above breath, "We almost hit her." At that range. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The point was made. The ocean itself had just been reminded that distance was no longer sanctuary. The weather swallowed Nowaki whole. Rain blurred her into myth, a smudge on the radar scope shrinking until she slipped beyond even the machine's certainty. She lived barely. Not because she outfought us, but because storms care nothing for the pride of steel. A strange quiet washed over the room, relief laced with something else. Sorrow, perhaps, or humility. The human heart prefers climax. History prefers quiet punctuation. We had demonstrated power, and in doing so, revealed the future. Not a world of battleships dueling under rising suns and storm flags, but one where wires, waves, and unseen pulses dictated fate. Makria's voice cut the hush. Cease fire. Maintain course. Recover aircraft. There was no cheer. No fist raised. Only the sound of men exhaling, as though they'd been holding their breath through the hinge of an age. On the bulkhead, condensation traced thin lines like tears. The ship seemed to mourn what we had just proven, that the world where ships met at sight and honor crossed the T had died under our keel. Never thought I'd see it, one chief whispered. We fired farther than any damn sailor ever dreamed. And hit, someone answered. But the chief only shook his head. And still, it doesn't feel like winning. I understood. We had chased glory only to find elegy. Battleships had not been defeated by enemies in steel, we had outgrown them ourselves. Outside, our wake stretched behind us, a long white scar across darkening sea, marking where tradition drowned and progress did not bother to look back. The men who died today fought a war they believed in. We answered with a war we built, and somewhere between those truths, the ocean recorded everything, without judgment, without bias, without forgetting. Plot course back to fleet, I ordered softly. We turned, engines easing. The world felt larger and smaller all at once. Ahead lay carriers that could kill over the curvature of the earth. Behind lay ships that died trying to close to where their fathers had once fought and won. Progress is merciless, and on that day, we served it faithfully. The storm rolled in. The horizon disappeared, and the Pacific closed around us as if trying to hide the fact that history had just changed shape in the space between two salvos and a vanishing wake. Night came slowly, as though the Pacific wasn't sure it wanted to dim after witnessing such a thing. The storm spent itself in gusts and low thunder, and then drifted away, leaving a sky scraped clean and honest. Behind us, Truk still smoldered, a black bruise across the horizon. Ahead, the carriers waited silent, patient, their flight decks already planning tomorrow's violence with the cool detachment of angels who kill from altitude. We steamed back toward them not as conquerors, but as men who had looked over the edge of one age and glimpsed the next rising behind it. The radio traffic was clinical recovery orders, fuel notices, position reports. No one said what we all felt. We had just written the longest-range surface engagement in naval history, and we knew even then that no one would ever break it. Because no one would ever try again. Battleships, those steel monarchs of an earlier century, had roared their final argument, and the world had answered, noted and irrelevant. In the plotting room, we secured the equipment with gentle hands, as if putting a cathedral to sleep. The rangekeeper ticked faintly, gears cooling, a mechanical heart slowing after sprinting at the limit of genius. I rested my palm on it the way one touches the shoulder of a friend after a funeral, not sorrow, not pride, just the quiet recognition that something ended here. "You think they'll remember this?" one of my fire controlmen asked, voice small in the hum of ventilation. I looked at him, at the smudge of grease on his cheek, the way he still stood slightly braced as though recoil might come again. "I think history remembers turning points," I said, "even when most don't recognize them as such." He nodded, unconvinced. Young men seldom believe eras can die quietly. We climbed to the weather deck. The air was cool now, touched by salt and night. Far to starboard, a carrier's running lights blinked soft, unthreatening, like a city waking. A single plane droned overhead, circling for recovery, engine notes steady and indifferent. That sound carried more power than our entire broadside. It was the hum of a new empire's heartbeat. On the horizon where Katuri died, only darkness remained. No oil fires left. No flares. War does not leave monuments at sea. It leaves silence. The ocean smooths its grave markers by dawn. One of the deckhands leaned beside me at the rail, fingers drumming the steel. "They fought hard," he said. Not a boast, not pity, just truth acknowledged between sailors. "Yes," I answered. "They fought the way they were taught. A world worked." "And we didn't?" he asked. "We fought the way a new world works," I replied. "That's all the difference there ever is." He fell quiet. The stars began to appear not gentle, but sharp, as if chiseled into the sky by something ancient that neither radar nor doctrine could ever touch. Below us, the ship's great engines eased, and Iowa settled into her stride, a predator cooling down from a hunt she'd trained her whole life for but would rarely taste again. Men slowly drifted back to tasks checking ammunition hoists, straightening charts, wiping oil from gunmetal like priests tidying a sanctuary after a final mass. We weren't jubilant. We weren't triumphant. We were caretakers of a discipline being retired mid-sentence. Before turning in, I walked the length of turret 2, running fingers along the blast shields, feeling faint warmth still radiating from steel that had spoken louder than history usually hears. I imagined the future missiles, jets, computers, small enough to fit in pockets, wars waged from screens and satellites. And then I pictured a Japanese sailor, somewhere beneath the waves behind us, clutching his uniform tightly against the cold as water swallowed him. He was not my enemy anymore. He was a boy who believed he served something eternal, only to discover he'd been handed a torch on the day fire was replaced by electricity. Progress is a thief. It steals certainty first, then purpose. I whispered into the empty dark, not sure who I was speaking to. We mattered today, even if only for today. By the time dawn brushed the Pacific in pale gold, we were back among the carriers, silent guardians, stretching deck nets, and warming catapults. Iowa passed them like a veteran slipping silently into a crowd of new recruits. No salute from the sky, no fanfare. Just steel, acknowledging steel, and the knowledge that in the great theater of war, someone else now owned the stage. Years later, I walked the decks again, not as an officer, but as a visitor reading placards with children tugging at their parents' sleeves. The turrets sat quiet, barrels lifted toward a sky uninterested in trajectories. The rangekeeper sat behind glass, gears still, purpose spent. I stood there with my hand on the cold casing, remembering the hum, the breath, the weight of command in mathematics and inevitability, and I realized something simple, something true. We had not fired to prove battleships still ruled. We fired to honor the men who built them, served them, died believing in them. We fired so they could exit history not with silence but with thunder. For 90 minutes on a February afternoon, the big guns spoke one last poem before they were shelved forever. And the ocean, as always, kept the memory.